Imagine a people who for nearly 2,000 years had no state, no unified territory, no common language of daily life. A people who were exiled, scattered across all continents, persecuted in Europe, taken into slavery in the East, sold on the slave markets of Rome. And yet, they returned. Not after one generation or two. After 19 centuries, this people founded their own state on the very land from which they had once been exiled. No other people in human history has accomplished anything similar. No people in the world has preserved its identity under conditions of dispersion for so long, without territory, without an army, without a state language, without a common authority. Historians call this phenomenon unique. This is the first enigma of our investigation today. But there is a second enigma, no less astonishing. In 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour signed a document that opened the way for Jews to their historical homeland. This document entered history as the Balfour Declaration, one of the key political acts of the 20th century, which changed the fate of an entire people and the map of an entire region. However, the same Balfour, in 1905, actively supported a British law restricting the entry of Jews into England. In his public statements, he called them undesirable aliens. According to available historical evidence, Balfour perceived Zionism, that is, the movement for the creation of a Jewish state, not as an act of historical justice, but as a convenient way to direct Jews away from Western capitals, ridding Europe of their presence. In other words, the document that gave an entire people hope of returning home was written by the hand of a man who did not want to see these people near himself. How did it happen that precisely such a person became one of the architects of Jewish statehood? And how did this story come about at all? The story of a people that began with one man who left his home in Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago. How did this solitary journey grow into a civilization that gave birth to 3 world religions, gave the world law, prophets, poetry, and science, and yet did not disappear despite all attempts to destroy it? Today we will travel this path from the very beginning to the end, through deserts and palaces, through wars and exiles, through the ruins of destroyed temples and the walls of revived cities. We will analyze sources, examine versions, hear the voices of those who stood at the crossroads of this history. 3,750 years in one investigation. It all began not with an army or a conquest. It all began with one man and his decision to leave. According to the biblical narrative, this man's name was Abram, and he lived in the city of one of the largest trading centers of ancient Mesopotamia, located in the territory of modern Iraq. Was a city with developed architecture, clay archives, and extensive trade. It was convenient and safe to live there, and yet Abram left. According to the Old Testament, God called out to him, "Leave your country, your people, your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you." According to biblical testimony, Abram was 75 years old at that time. Together with his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot, he set out on a journey through deserts and foothills, along ancient trade routes that merchant caravans had traveled long before him. This path ran through the Fertile Crescent, from Mesopotamia through Syria and down to the Mediterranean coast. There, on the border of the desert and coastal plains, lay the land of Canaan. The land of Canaan, where Abram arrived, was not empty. It was inhabited by numerous tribes: Hittites, Amorites, Hivites, Jebusites, Canaanites, Perizzites. Biblical texts portray them differently. In some episodes, the Canaanites are hospitable and friendly towards the newcomer. In others, hostile and wary. These were peoples with established traditions, their own languages, and elaborate cults. The Canaanites practiced polytheism. They had gods of fertility, gods of rain, gods of war. On the hills stood altars with sacrificial sats. It was into this world of polytheism that a man came, carrying something completely different. Faith in a single God who had made a special and exclusive covenant with him. According to biblical testimony, Abram and his family gradually settled in Canaan. They roamed this land, herded livestock, stopped at wells, and pitched tents. Several times famine forced them to go to Egypt and return back. Life was full of difficulties, but the covenant remained in force. At 99 years old, according to tradition, Abram made a new, more solemn covenant with God, and his name was changed. He became Abraham. This change of name in the ancient cultures of the Near East meant something fundamentally important: a new purpose, a new role in history, a new connection with the one who gives names. Abraham died at the age of 175 and was buried in the cave of Machpelah near the city of Hebron, a city that still exists today in the territory of the west bank of the Jordan River and remains a place of pilgrimage. Abraham had two sons, Isaac from his wife Sarah, and Ishmael from the maidservant Hagar. These two brothers went their separate ways, carrying different destinies with them. According to the views of religious traditions, Isaac became the progenitor of the Jews, and Ishmael the progenitor of the Arabs. Two peoples destined to share the same narrow strip of land for millennia trace their ancestry back to one common father. This genealogical detail is not merely curious in itself. It sets the tone for all subsequent history, in which kinship and rivalry prove inseparable. Isaac had a son named Jacob, notable for receiving a new name from God, Israel. Jacob's 12 sons became the founders of the 12 tribes, around which all the subsequent history of the people would be built. The names of these sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Joseph, and Benjamin, echo through the millennia in prayers, in the names of biblical books, in a geography of the Near East. But before the descendants of these 12 would occupy their lands, they were to undergo a long and painful ordeal, which they themselves would remember until the end of their history: the ordeal of Egyptian slavery. Among Jacob's 12 sons was one destined for a special fate: Joseph. Handsome and gifted, loved by his father more than his brothers, he aroused their envy and hostility. In the end, the brothers sold him to traders heading to Egypt. Joseph found himself in a foreign country, without family, without language, without protection. He was bought by one of the Egyptian nobles. Then, accused of a crime he did not commit, he ended up in prison. It seemed like the end. But it was in prison that he was noticed. He could interpret dreams. Pharaoh dreamed of 7 fat cows and 7 lean ones, 7 full ears of grain and 7 empty ones, and no one at court could explain this dream. Joseph explained: 7 years of abundance, 7 years of famine. Grain must be stored. Pharaoh believed him and made Joseph the manager of the entire country's food system. When the famine came, and it came exactly as Joseph had predicted, peoples from all over the Near East came for grain, including Joseph's brothers. The meeting was bitter, and reconciling at the same time. In the end, the entire family, 70 people, moved to Egypt. At first, they lived there in peace and prosperity, under the patronage of a high-ranking relative. But Joseph died, and the pharaohs changed, and the Israelite people multiplied, and this began to frighten the Egyptian rulers. Fear of a growing foreign people turned into harsh measures. The Israelites were enslaved. They had to build the pharaoh's cities, Pithom and Ramses, under the scorching sun, worked to exhaustion, buried dead comrades right at the construction sites. According to the testimony of the Old Testament, they spent 430 years in Egypt. And then Moses appeared, a man who was to become not just a leader of the people, but a lawgiver, a prophet, and one of the most influential figures in the history of human civilization. His story begins with a paradox. Born a Jew at a time when Pharaoh ordered all newborn Jewish boys to be drowned, he was saved when his mother placed him in a basket and set it adrift on the Nile. The basket was found by Pharaoh's daughter. The boy grew up at the Egyptian court as a prince, accustomed to luxury, education, and power. But his roots would not let him go. Seeing an Egyptian overseer torturing a Hebrew slave, he killed the overseer and was forced to flee into the desert. In the Sinai desert, he tended sheep, and there, at a burning bush that burned but was not consumed, he heard a voice. Return to Egypt. Become the voice of your people. Go to Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go." Moses returned. Negotiations with Pharaoh, accompanied, according to the biblical description, by the 10 plagues of Egypt, from the plague of locusts to the death of the firstborn, led to Pharaoh finally letting the people go. The crossing of the sea, 40 years of wandering in the desert, receiving the 10 commandments on Mount Sinai. All this became part of a grand narrative that the Jewish people retell from generation to generation to this day. The exodus from Egypt became for the Jewish people what the moment of a nation's birth is for other peoples. It was not just liberation from physical slavery. It was the acquisition of an identity based on faith in a single God and on the specific historical experience of deliverance. It was during the wanderings in the desert that Moses received the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, the foundation of Jewish law. The first of them sounded simple and revolutionary at the same time. The Lord is your God. The Lord is one. In a world where every city had its own God, every natural element its own patron, every pharaoh declared himself the living embodiment of a deity, this idea was a genuine revolution in the history of human thought. Monotheism became the cornerstone on which not only the history of the Jewish people was built, but subsequently 2 world religions, Christianity and Islam, both of which grew directly from this tradition. The Ark of the Covenant, a wooden chest covered in gold, containing the tablets with the 10 Commandments, became the most sacred relic of the people. It was carried before the army on special poles. Its presence meant the presence of God Himself. Rituals and political decisions were built around it. And it was with this ark that the Israelites, under the leadership of Joshua, Moses' successor, entered the Promised Land. But the entry into this land was not peaceful. Canaan, where the descendants of Abraham returned after more than 4 centuries of absence, was still densely populated by numerous tribes with fortified cities, chariots, and their own military traditions. The conquest took not years, but generations. Joshua commanded an army that fought city by city. The walls of Jericho, which fell, according to biblical tradition, from the sound of trumpets, entered history as a symbol of victory achieved not only by the force of arms, but even after Joshua's death, the conquest remained incomplete. The 12 tribes settled in the territories allotted to each, but they had no single center of power, no unified army. In times of military threat, the people united around so-called judges, religious and military leaders capable of rallying their tribesmen to fight. Samson, the mighty man from the tribe of Dan, whose strength lay in his hair. Deborah, a prophetess and military commander, one of the rare women to hold a position of leadership in the ancient world. Gideon, a warrior who defeated a huge Midianite army with a handful of select fighters. These images have survived millennia, but the authority of the judges ended with the crisis. As soon as the threat receded, unity disintegrated again. And the Israelites spoke more and more insistently about needing a permanent ruler, a king capable of holding the country together not only in times of war. The prophet Samuel long resisted this idea. In his conviction, only God could be the true king of Israel. He perceived the establishment of an earthly monarchy as a renunciation of God in favor of man. But the people insisted. In the end, Samuel anointed Saul of the tribe of Benjamin as king, the first king of a united Israel. Saul was a warrior, taller than all his subjects, brave and decisive in battle. His military successes commanded respect. But it was he who was destined to discover what many leaders learned too late. Power given from above can be taken away just as suddenly as it was granted. From the shadows at Saul's court emerged a young shepherd from Bethlehem, David of the tribe of Judah. His duel with the Philistine giant Goliath became one of the most famous episodes in all of world history. A youth without armor or experience against a huge warrior in full regalia, and victory with a sling and a stone. This image became an eternal symbol of the triumph of spirit over brute physical force. But behind this episode lies an entire life, full of wars, betrayals, court intrigues, love, and tragedies. David came from a different tribe than Saul. He was not his descendant, and it was he who founded the first true royal dynasty of Israel, a dynasty that would rule in Jerusalem for 400 years. Under David, Jerusalem, previously held by the Jebusites, was conquered. This city, standing on rocky hills, was chosen as the capital of the United Kingdom for a reason. It did not belong to any of the 12 tribes, and thus could become a neutral center for all. Since then, for 3,000 years, Jerusalem has not ceased to be an object of disputes, prayers, and wars. The territories under David's rule expanded from the Sinai Peninsula in the south to the Euphrates River in the north, limits that the Israelite state had never reached before and would never reach again. According to tradition, David was both a poet and a musician. The Book of Psalms, a collection of hymns traditionally associated with his name, still resounds in the worship services of 3 world religions today. His greatest dream was to build a majestic temple for the Ark of the Covenant, but this task fell to his son. Solomon entered history as a king of wisdom, trade, and construction. Under him, the first temple in Jerusalem was built, a structure of Lebanese cedar and gold, its inner walls covered with carvings and gilding. In its Holy of Holies was placed the Ark of the Covenant. Finally, after centuries of wandering and temporary shelters, the most sacred relic of the people found a permanent home. Solomon traded with all the known world of that time, with Arabia and Egypt, with the Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon, with the mysterious land of Ophir, from which gold was brought. The Queen of Sheba, ruler of a distant South Arabian country, according to tradition, personally undertook a long journey to test his famous wisdom. This was a golden age. The people of Israel would never again achieve such a level of prosperity and peace. But the splendor of Solomon's kingdom concealed deep cracks. Luxury required money. Money required taxes. Taxes bred discontent, especially among the northern tribes, who felt that the main beneficiary of the kingdom's wealth was Judah and Jerusalem, not them. After Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam inherited the throne. The leaders of the northern tribes came to pay homage to him with one demand: lighten the burden your father placed upon us. Young courtiers advised him to answer harshly, and he listened to them. His reply entered history as an example of the arrogance of power. "My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions." The rupture was immediate. Around 931 BC, the United Kingdom split into two states. The 10 northern tribes created their own, the Kingdom of Israel, with its capital in Samaria. The 2 southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, remained under the rule of David's descendants in Jerusalem, forming the Kingdom of Judah. A division that might have seemed a political episode proved irreversible. From this moment, the history of the Jewish people unfolds on 2 parallel stages, and both ultimately end in catastrophe. The northern kingdom lasted just over 200 years. In 722 BC, the Assyrian army, one of the most formidable military machines of the ancient world, equipped with siege engines, war chariots, and refined logistics, captured the northern kingdom's capital, Samaria. The Assyrians applied a tested method of governing conquered peoples: mass forced resettlement. The inhabitants of conquered territories were deported to other parts of the empire, and settlers from other regions were brought in their place. This method was aimed against the very possibility of national self-awareness. It severed family ties, blurred identity, and deprived a people of its historical memory. The 10 northern tribes of Israel, led into Assyrian exile, gradually dissolved among foreign peoples. They ceased to speak their language, ceased to preserve their traditions, ceased to remember who they were. In history, they remain under one name that echoes forever: the 10 lost tribes of Israel. This disappearance gave rise to one of the most enduring mysteries of world history. Where did they go? What became of them? Over the centuries, the most diverse peoples and communities have declared themselves their descendants. Mountain tribes of Afghanistan, some communities in India, Ethiopian Beta Israel Jews, certain groups in Japan, Native American tribes of the American continent. Some of these versions are supported by individual researchers, and debates around them do not subside. But a historically confirmed answer to the question of the fate of the lost tribes does not exist to this day. This is one of those mysteries that history, it seems, does not intend to reveal. Meanwhile, the southern kingdom of Judah continued to exist. It survived the demise of its northern neighbor, survived several Assyrian invasions, and continued to hold on, relying on the Jerusalem temple, on the memory of David and Solomon, on the tradition of prophecy. The great prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, lived precisely in this period and left texts that became part of world religious literature. They warned kings, denounced injustice, predicted catastrophe. Their predictions came true. In 587 BC, the Babylonian army under the command of King Nebuchadnezzar took Jerusalem. The siege lasted for months. When the walls fell, that which no one wanted to allow, and which happened anyway, occurred. Solomon's temple, which had stood for 4 centuries, the focal point of the entire religious life of the people, the repository of the Ark of the Covenant, was destroyed and burned. The city lay in ruins. Most of Jerusalem's inhabitants were taken captive to Babylon. The kingdom of Judah ceased to exist. Thus began the Babylonian captivity, one of the most difficult periods of Jewish history, giving rise to an entire layer of religious and poetic literature that has survived to this day. It was then that the lines were written that became one of the most poignant texts about longing for the homeland. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. It was at this time that questions arose that became defining for all Jewish thought. How can a people maintain a connection with God far from the temple? How to pray without an altar, without sacrifices, without the holy city? How to be God's people when this God, by all external signs, allowed the destruction of the very place where he dwelt? The answer to these questions was the development of the synagogue, a gathering for prayer and study of Scripture as an alternative center of religious life. It was in the Babylonian exile that the Jewish people first learned fully how to be themselves without a state, without a temple, without their native land. This ability would later play a key role in their survival. The captivity lasted 50 years, and then something happened that no one expected. The Persian king Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 538 BC. Cyrus was a ruler of a type rare for his time. He did not seek to destroy the cultures of conquered peoples, but preferred to preserve them, winning loyalty through respect for local traditions and shrines. His policy was both humane and pragmatic. That same year, he issued a decree allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. The Jews were granted the status of a self-governing province within the Persian Empire. For the first time in history, an entire people was returning to their homeland from exile, not by force of arms, but by royal decree. Not everyone decided to return. Many Jews, over generations of life in Babylon, had established their lives there, put down roots, and preferred to stay. Those who did return found a destroyed city and the ruins of the temple. Restoration took decades. By 458 BC, the priest Ezra and his assistant Nehemiah undertook the construction, first the city walls, then the temple. The second Jerusalem temple, built on the site of Solomon's, became the center of a new era in Jewish history, known as the Second Temple period. This period would last for more than 5 centuries. Let us pause for a moment. We have traversed 1,500 years of history, from one nomad who left Mesopotamia to an entire people twice exiled and twice returned. Each time, exile looked like the end. Each time it turned out, it was not. But the most astonishing thing is this: precisely those periods when everything seemed lost, when there was no temple, no city, no land, it was then that this people created its most important texts. They recorded laws, collected prophecies, debated interpretations. Returning from Babylon, the Jews brought with them not just memories, but new books, new forms of prayer, a new depth of religious consciousness. In exile, texts were born that would later form the core of the Old Testament in its final form. Here it is appropriate to formulate the question differently. We are accustomed to thinking of exile as a tragedy. But perhaps it was precisely exile that generated the intellectual and spiritual toolkit that allowed this people to survive, while other peoples held on to land and disappeared with it. This people learned to hold on to an idea, onto a text, onto memory. This is not a romanticization of suffering. It is an attempt to understand the mechanism, and in this lies the key to our first mystery. The answer to it lies not in politics and not in military force. It lies in what happened in the Babylonian synagogues, in the libraries of Cordoba, in the Polish yeshivas, in the New York printing houses, in books, in debates, in memory. But ahead lay even more severe trials. The Second Temple period is a time when imperial masters changed over the Jews one after another. After the Persians came the Greeks. Alexander the Great conquered Judea in 332 BC. In general, his policy towards the Jews was tolerant. He respected their religion and did not insist on the adoption of Greek gods. But after his death, his heirs, the Diadochi, divided the vast empire among themselves, and Judea became a subject of dispute between the Ptolemies, who ruled Egypt, and the Seleucids, who ruled Syria. Initially, this coexistence was relatively peaceful. Jewish scholars translated the Torah into Greek. Thus appeared the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, which opened Jewish wisdom to the entire Hellenistic world. But everything changed in 167 BC. The Seleucid king Antiochus IV embarked on a course of forcibly implanting Greek culture among all the peoples of his empire, a policy the Greeks called Hellenization. He prohibited Jewish religious practices, circumcision, Sabbath observance, Torah study. He compelled Jews to participate in pagan sacrifices. And finally, the most unbearable, he desecrated the Jerusalem temple. He erected an altar to Zeus there and sacrificed a pig, an animal forbidden by Jewish law. For a believing Jew, this was not just blasphemy, it was the destruction of the meaning of existence. In the town of Modin lived a priest named Mattathias. When royal officials demanded that he publicly offer a pagan sacrifice before the people, he refused and killed a Jew who had voluntarily agreed to do so. After this, he fled to the mountains with his sons. Others followed him. Thus began the Maccabean Revolt, one of the few popular uprisings in history to achieve its goal. Mattathias' sons, who gained the nickname Maccabees, meaning hammers, proved to be brilliant military commanders. Despite a colossal difference in weaponry and numbers, they repeatedly defeated a significantly stronger opponent, using knowledge of the terrain and high morale. In the year 164 BC, they entered Jerusalem and cleansed the temple of pagan symbols. The holiday of Hanukkah, celebrated by Jews to this day, originates precisely from this moment, from the miracle of the oil, which should have lasted for 1 day, but lasted for 8. After the victory, the independent Hasmonean dynasty was founded in Judea, the last independent Jewish state before the arrival of Rome. Rome arrived in 63 BC. The commander Pompey entered Jerusalem and incorporated Judea into the sphere of Roman rule. Relations between Rome and the Jewish population were ambiguous from the very beginning. Rome granted the provinces a certain autonomy, did not insist on the worship of Roman gods, and allowed Jews to live by their own laws, provided they paid taxes and did not rebel. But subjugation was always felt. Any disobedience threatened an immediate and brutal response. During this period, Jesus of Nazareth lived and preached in Judea, a Jewish teacher whom his followers considered the Messiah, the Savior promised by the prophets. His crucifixion around the year 30 AD, a standard Roman execution for politically dangerous individuals, triggered a wave of consequences that would change human history far beyond Judea. But within our story, something else is important. His execution added another layer of tension to an already complex situation in the province, between different groups within Jewish society and between that society and Roman authority. By the year 66 AD, the tension had reached its limit. The First Jewish-Roman War began. The Jews fought with the desperation of people who had nothing to lose. But Rome was incomparably more powerful and possessed the experience of dozens of suppressed revolts across the empire. In the year 70 AD, the future Emperor Titus entered Jerusalem after a long and grueling siege. What occurred entered history as one of the greatest catastrophes of antiquity. The city was burned. The Second Temple, which had stood for 5 centuries, was razed to the ground. Only one section of the fortress wall surrounding the Temple Mount survived, the very one known today as the Western Wall, or Wailing Wall, which remains the primary site of Jewish prayer in the world to this day. According to the historian Josephus, an eyewitness to those events, a huge portion of the city's population perished, and about 100,000 people were captured and enslaved. Josephus, a tragic and contradictory figure in his own right, he was a Jewish military commander who surrendered to Rome during the revolt, switched to the enemy's side, and spent the rest of his life at the Flavian court, recording the history of his people from an imperial perspective. Jews regarded him as a traitor, Romans as a useful foreign element. And yet, it is his works, the Jewish War and Jewish antiquities, that became the primary historical source for this era. Without Josephus, we would know incomparably less about this period. About 30,000 captives were sent to Carthage. Others were scattered across the Mediterranean. The Arch of Titus, erected in Rome to commemorate this victory and standing to this day on the Via Sacra, bears reliefs depicting trophies from the destroyed Jerusalem, the 7-branched menorah, the sacred table. In 1949, the revived state of Israel would choose precisely the image of the menorah as its national symbol. History can be ironic. But this was not yet the end. In the year 132 AD, under the leadership of Simon Bar Kokhba, proclaimed by some as a kind of Messiah, the last large-scale Jewish revolt against Rome began. It was brutally suppressed. The Roman historian Cassius Dio described the consequences. According to him, 50 fortified strongholds and nearly 1,000 villages were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people perished in battles, and even more died from hunger and disease. After the suppression of the revolt, Jews were officially forbidden to enter Jerusalem, except for one day a year. Another step was more symbolic. Emperor Hadrian renamed the province of Judea to Syria Palestina. The name was chosen deliberately from the word Philistines, the historical adversaries of Israel, to erase the very name of the people from the map. It is from this 2nd century AD administrative decision that the word Palestine originated. History repeated itself for the 3rd time. The people once again found themselves in dispersion, this time for 19 centuries. The diaspora created a remarkable geography of the Jewish world. Jews who settled in Germany and northeastern France became known as Ashkenazim. Those who established themselves on the Iberian Peninsula, in Spain and Portugal, are known as Sephardim, from the ancient Hebrew name for Spain. Jews of Egypt, Iraq, and Yemen, Mizrahim, meaning Eastern. Jews of Central Asia and the Caucasus, Bukharan. In the 17th and 18th centuries, some Ashkenazi Jews from Europe crossed the ocean to the New World, Dutch Brazil, then North America. Thus, new communities began to form in Amsterdam, London, New York. Small at first, but later becoming the most important centers of Jewish life. Each of these communities over time developed its own dialect, its own traditions, its own cuisine and music. Yiddish among Ashkenazim, Ladino among Sephardim, Judeo-Arabic dialects among Mizrahim. Yet all of them preserved the common religion, a common sacred text, a unified calendar of holidays, and perhaps most importantly, a shared memory of a lost homeland. The Middle Ages were a time of unstable equilibrium for the Jews of Europe. Their position depended entirely on the will of local rulers. Tolerated today, expelled tomorrow. Pogroms, organized attacks on Jewish communities, periodically erupted across Europe, especially during times of social upheaval, when a scapegoat was needed. Jews were accused of plague epidemics, of secret conspiracies against the Christian faith, of the most unimaginable crimes. Most of these accusations had no factual basis, but that hardly stopped anyone. In the year 1099, the Crusaders captured Jerusalem. Their campaign was accompanied by indiscriminate brutality. They killed everyone. According to some accounts, the Jewish and Muslim inhabitants of the city fought side by side against the invaders and perished together after its fall. A wave of fear swept through Jewish communities from the Rhine to the Euphrates. Yet it was precisely in the medieval centuries that Jewish scholars played an indispensable role as intermediaries between civilizations. In Muslim Spain, known by the Arabic name Al-Andalus, Jewish philosophers, doctors, and poets worked within the same cultural space as Arab and Berber thinkers. Maimonides, Moshe ben Maimon, born in Cordoba in the 12th century, created philosophical works here that fused the tradition of Judaism with Aristotelian logic. His works were read and cited by the scholastics of Christian Europe. Jewish translators translated the works of Greek philosophers and Arab physicians into Latin, transmitting knowledge to Europe that might otherwise have been lost. In a certain sense, it was through Jewish intermediaries that Aristotle returned to medieval Europe. In the year 1492, the very year Columbus reached the shores of America, the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella signed the Alhambra Decree, an edict expelling Jews from Spain. The Sephardic Jews, who had lived on the peninsula for hundreds of years and created one of the most brilliant cultural flowerings of Jewish history, the famous Iberian tradition of philosophy, poetry, and medicine, were forced to leave the country within a few months. Thousands perished on the road. The survivors scattered across North Africa, the Balkans, and the Middle East. One of the main refuges became the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Bayezid II welcomed the exiles, understanding that educated, mercantile, multilingual people would benefit his state. According to some historical accounts, he remarked that the Spanish monarchs, by expelling the Jews, were impoverishing their country and enriching his. Sephardim settled in Istanbul, Thessaloniki, Jerusalem, Alexandria, and for several generations preserved their Ladino language based on medieval Spanish. In the Ottoman Empire, which captured Jerusalem in 1516, Jews enjoyed relative freedom. They traded, built synagogues, held some administrative positions. They paid a special tax for non-Muslims and observed certain restrictions, but by the standards of contemporary Europe, their position was incomparably more stable. A curious historical detail. Both David Ben-Gurion, the future first Prime Minister of Israel, and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, the future second president of the country, studied at Istanbul University in the early 20th century as subjects of the Ottoman Empire. Both came to receive an education in the capital of the very power that would disappear from the world map within a few decades, and on the ruins of its possessions, their state would arise. Ben-Gurion, by the way, in those years assumed that a Jewish state would emerge as an autonomy within a renewed Ottoman Empire. Revolutions, both Turkish and the World War, shattered this plan, opening a completely different path. History weaves threads in the most unexpected ways. The Age of Enlightenment seemed a time of hope. Ideas of equality and civil rights opened doors for Jews that had previously been closed. In France, Germany, and other countries, Jews gained citizenship, could study at universities, and pursue liberal professions. Many rapidly assimilated, adopted local customs, changed their names. It seemed the age-old confrontation was receding. But the Enlightenment also gave birth to a new form of anti-Semitism, no longer religious, but national. In the 19th century, theories of race and national spirit spread across Europe. Jews were declared not merely heretics, but aliens, outsiders who by their very nature could not become true Germans or French. This was a fundamentally different logic of hatred. It did not allow escape even through renunciation of faith or conversion. It was more dangerous than any before. It was against the backdrop of these changes that Theodor Herzl, an Austrian journalist of Hungarian origin, came to a conclusion that would change history. He saw how educated, assimilated Jews still remained outsiders in the countries of their birth. The Dreyfus Affair, the case of a French Jewish officer falsely accused of treason amid the roar of an anti-Semitic mob in a country considered a model of enlightenment, made a staggering impression on Herzl. He concluded, Jews would never be safe among other peoples. They needed their own land, their own state. Only in this way could they become subjects of history, not its victims. In 1896, Herzl published the book, The Jewish State, outlining his vision. It had the effect of an explosion in the Jewish world. The following year, the first Zionist Congress was held in Basel, the first organized gathering of supporters for the creation of a Jewish state. Herzl personally met with German Kaiser Wilhelm II and Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II, attempting to secure their support. Both refused. Herzl died in 1904 at the age of 44, not living to see his idea realized. He was exhausted by years of negotiations, rejections, and organizational work. Shortly before his death, he wrote that he believed a Jewish state would be founded in 50 years. He was off by only 1 year. Israel was proclaimed in 1948, 44 years after his death. The movement he created could no longer be stopped. Jewish immigration to Palestine, called Aliyah, meaning ascent, gradually increased in waves. Those who arrived founded agricultural collectives, kibbutzim, built roads, drained swamps, and constructed cities. Tel Aviv, founded in 1909 as a small suburban settlement near Jaffa, would, within a few decades, become the first entirely Jewish city of the modern era. Meanwhile, the world was moving toward a catastrophe that would change everything. The First World War destroyed several great empires at once: the Russian, Austro-Hungarian, German, and Ottoman. For Jews, this meant several things simultaneously: the collapse of the familiar order, the opening of new opportunities, and new dangers. In Russia, the monarchy fell, under which Jews had been restricted in their rights and confined to the Pale of Settlement. The February Revolution of 1917 granted them civil rights for the first time in Russian history. But it was followed by the October Revolution, civil war, and waves of pogroms in Ukraine and Belarus, where hundreds of thousands of Jews perished. The chaos and violence pushed thousands to immigrate, some to Western Europe, some to America, some to Palestine. Germany was defeated, which gave rise to a deep national crisis and resentment that political demagogues immediately exploited. Jews were increasingly portrayed as culprits for the military defeat and economic hardships. This was a lie, but it fell on fertile ground. The Ottoman Empire ceased to exist, its territories coming under the control of British and French mandates. It was then that the document we spoke of at the very beginning appeared. In November 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour sent an official letter to Lord Walter Rothschild, a prominent representative of British Jewry, stating that His Majesty's government viewed with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Two paragraphs that changed the course of history. Why did Britain do this? There are several explanations, and they are not mutually exclusive. There was genuine sympathy for the Jewish cause among some British politicians raised in the biblical tradition. There were geopolitical calculations. Britain wanted to secure the support of influential Jewish communities, primarily American, at a time when the United States was still hesitating to enter the war. Finally, there was Balfour's own logic. He perceived Zionism not as the restoration of justice, but as a way to direct Jews away from Europe. As for the Arab majority living in Palestine, no one asked them. Arab political leaders, learning of the declaration, regarded it as a blatant violation of promises the British had given them during the same war in exchange for an anti-Ottoman revolt. The contradiction between promises made to different sides was obvious even then, and the British government understood perfectly well that it was creating an insoluble knot. Despite this, the declaration was adopted. This contradiction became the seed of future conflicts, the fruits of which the world reaps to this day. After the war, Palestine came under British administration within the League of Nations mandate system. Jewish immigration began to steadily increase, first slowly, then faster and faster, as Europe became more dangerous. The Arab population, seeing the changing demographic balance, began to resist. In 1936, the Arab Revolt broke out. The British suppressed it harshly. According to various estimates, Arab casualties over 3 years amounted to about 20,000 people. In 1939, London issued a white paper severely restricting Jewish immigration to Palestine. The document proposed a plan to create a joint Arab-Jewish state within 10 years and set a limit on Jewish immigration of 75,000 people over the next 5 years, after which it was to cease entirely unless the consent of the Arab majority was obtained. In response, Jewish paramilitary organizations in Palestine intensified their activities. The most famous of these was the Irgun. Its operations, attacks on British police stations, bombings of transport infrastructure, were classified as terrorist activities by a number of sources at the time. including British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The Irgun's most famous operation was the destruction of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem in 1946. 91 people died in the explosion. After the creation of the State of Israel, some Irgun fighters joined the ranks of the Israeli army. For the Jews of Europe, already experiencing Nazi laws firsthand, the restriction on immigration meant closed doors to the only place that could take them. Nazi Germany, with Hitler's rise to power in 1933, began the systematic persecution of Jews. The Nuremberg laws stripped them of citizenship. Kristallnacht in 1938 revealed the scale of state terror. The beginning of the Second World War opened the possibility for implementing what the Nazi leadership called the final solution. During the war years, 6 million Jews perished in death camps, ghettos, mass shootings, and from starvation and disease. 1/3 of the entire Jewish people on earth. Entire communities, Polish, Hungarian, Dutch, Greek, Lithuanian, Belarusian, French, were destroyed completely or almost completely. In some Polish cities, Jews made up 50 to 70% of the population before the war. After the war, almost none remained. The Warsaw Ghetto, where 400,000 people were confined, revolted in 1943, a final act of desperate resistance before physical annihilation. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek. These names became synonymous with the industrial destruction of people. The European Jewish world, which had existed for 1,000 years, creating a rich cultural, intellectual, and religious tradition, was exterminated within a few years. The scale of this catastrophe changed the political climate of the planet. It became obvious that the survivors did not want and could not return to the countries where their families had been destroyed. In 1947, the United Nations approved a plan to partition Palestine into 2 states. Arab countries and the Arab population of Palestine rejected this plan. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the same one who had once studied at Istanbul University, proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel. The next day, the armies of 5 Arab states crossed its borders. Israel withstood. But the price of this victory was high for everyone, including the hundreds of thousands of Arab residents of Palestine who left their homes during the fighting. In the following decades, the country experienced several more wars. The Suez Crisis in 1956, a joint attack by Israel, Britain, and France on Egypt following the nationalization of the Suez Canal. The Six-Day War in 1967. In 6 days, the Israeli army captured the Sinai Peninsula, the west bank of the Jordan River, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights. This was a military triumph, but it also created a political knot that remains untangled to this day. The Yom Kippur War in 1973, a surprise attack by Egypt and Syria on the holiest Jewish holiday, bringing Israel to the brink of catastrophe and ultimately ending in its military victory. In 1978, Egypt and Israel signed the Camp David Accords, the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab state. For this step, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat paid with his life, assassinated by Islamic radicals in 1981. In the 90s, the Oslo negotiations between the Israeli government and the Palestine Liberation Organization briefly opened hope for a settlement. It seemed the conflict was finally moving toward resolution, but it did not happen. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a tangle of contradictions that is very difficult to unravel. At its core lies a question with no simple answer: how to reconcile the demands of 2 peoples claiming the same land, each of whom can present their own genuine historical right. One people whose history on this land stretches back to deepest antiquity, having passed through exiles, pogroms, and genocide before returning. Another people whose ancestors lived here for hundreds of years, built houses, cultivated the land, and found themselves displaced by events they did not choose. History rarely offers simple solutions. More often, it offers understanding. Let us return to our two riddles. The first, how did a people without a state, without land, without a common language, preserve themselves for 19 centuries? In return, the answer, perhaps, is this: they preserved themselves from within. In books, in laws, in memory, in rituals, in the words spoken annually, next year in Jerusalem. Memory proved stronger than any state. This people turned their very survival into a form of existence impervious to external destruction, because it lived not in stones or walls, but in people. The second riddle: why was the document that opened the way home for the Jews signed by a man with anti-Semitic views? The answer, perhaps, is even more bitter, because history is driven not only by good intentions, but also by self-serving calculations, coincidental alignments of interest, and the convenience of others' goals. Sometimes the road to justice is paved by the hands of those who never thought of justice. This in itself tells us something important about how the world works, far less romantic than we might wish, but far more honest. 3,750 years. From one man who left Mesopotamia under the scorching sun to a state founded on the shores of the Mediterranean after millennia of dispersion. A history that does not end. A history that continues right now.